Hey everyone, my name is Derek Royden. For those who haven't been here before, you probably saw my title at the beginning. I hope you're all doing well on this Saturday, Cinco de Mayo. I would like to wish the happiest and best of all days to all my friends in Mexico and here in Canada and elsewhere who celebrate this fantastic holiday. Hope you're all out enjoying yourselves, and maybe you'll catch up with this video tomorrow. So, to get straight to today's story, I want to talk a little about something that I think a lot of people are maybe worried about or thinking about a lot lately, because of course there's been a non-stop deluge of articles and of course news segments, especially news segments on fake news. Now, these are both coming from the corporate media, who are basically opposed to the current president of the United States, but I mean, even in the UK, it's working in a different way, being used mostly by those opposed to Jeremy Corbyn, spreading completely untrue stories about him. They have been for months. I mean, I think the most ridiculous one was that he was a Czech spy. Maybe what I'll do is I'll link to that article so you can check it out below. But I thought I'd take a slightly different tack today, because last week I was on Counterpunch, which is a website I read pretty much on a daily basis. It's only they only post Monday to Friday. I have a lot of differing viewpoints, not just my style of left, but even libertarians, other people. And it was an article by this guy named David McCary, and it's called "Where It All Began: The Dawn of Fake News." This was a story that I didn't know about that I thought might be interesting for some of you out there, so that's what we're going to get into. This might be a two-part video, I'm not sure. I think I'm just going to try and get through this historical part, and then a couple of definitions that I wanted to put at the end, and then maybe we'll do a follow-up on this after. I guess wait and see what kind of response there is. Okay, so great. It's believed, as McCary says, that the first real example of fake news, at least kind of in the modern era, was during the gubernatorial campaign or governor's race in California in 1934. In this campaign, there was an incumbent Republican who actually wasn't he's incumbent because he was the lieutenant governor, and the governor of the state died. So he had some problems. There was a huge general strike in San Francisco, like I think in '33. So he was not very popular with working people, and of course the vast numbers of poor people, because we have to remember that this is the height of the Great Depression in the United States. So his opponent, running as a Democrat, was a former socialist who was trying to bring socialist ideas into the Democratic Party. Named Upton Sinclair. Probably most of you know him. He was kind of a famous muckraking journalist. He wrote a lot about, a variety of topics, from the meatpacking industry in Chicago to New York high society, but he was very well known as kind of being a left-wing writer. It's kind of one of the regrets that I have, is that I've really never delved into his stuff. I mean, I've heard about him a lot over the years, but it wasn't a style of writing that when I was in school, or even really up to the present, that I can think of. This kind of social realist style hasn't really been in fashion, so I never got around to reading a lot of his work, or other really important writers from that time like Ida B. Wells. But I digress. So, in 1933, Sinclair quickly wrote a 60-page book titled "I, Governor of California, and How I Ended Poverty, a True Story of the Future." The cover also bore the message, "This is not just a pamphlet, this is the beginning of a crusade, a 2-year plan to make over the state, to capture the Democratic primaries and use an old party for a new job. The epic plan," he called it, "end poverty in California." So when I was working on this article, or when I was working on this story, kind of just putting the ideas together in my head, I went and did another Google search, found a few more articles about this particular election campaign, and the one that I rely on the most, probably even more than the original Counterpunch article, is one that was in the Smithsonian magazine, and there'll be a link to it below. It's really interesting because it just kind of breaks down the history doesn't get too much into even necessarily taking a side. But anyway, to his great surprise, Sinclair's book became another bestseller, with hundreds of thousands of copies circulating around the state. More than 2,000 epic clubs sprang up around California, and they organized massive voter registration drives. Within months, Sinclair became a legitimate candidate for governor. I believe at certain points in the race, Sinclair was even winning. So, besides Merriman, who was his Republican opponent, there were many people, of course, who opposed Sinclair, many powerful people, people with a lot of money. One of them was Louis B. Mayer of MGM Studios. Now, what he did was he basically contacted or contracted, I guess, a early version of an advertising public relations firm called Whitaker and Baxter. As the Smithsonian Magazine goes on to say, working quietly behind the scenes were two, and this isn't on the anti or the pro-Merriman or anti-Upton Sinclair campaign. So working quietly behind the scenes were two political consultants, Clem Whitaker and Leon Baxter. They had formed a group called Campaigns Inc. The year before, and had already been retained by conglomerates like Pacific Gas and Electric, Standard Oil. It's huge monopolies from that time. The two consultants, like their clients, were determined to stop what they called Sinclairism at any cost, and they had just 2 months to do it. So it was really getting close to the wire when these kind of large business interests really started to get involved in the campaign. And what was really fascinating about it was that they basically, they worked with newspapers, they worked with various other ways of getting their messages out there. But one way that they did this was they created what looked exactly like the newsreels, which at this time was a way that a lot of people would get their news. They would go to the movies, and then there would be newsreels that would tell you about what was happening in the world prior to the film. Now, what Whitaker and Baxter did was they created what looked like newsreels, but were actually like taken from old footage in some cases, and also filmed right now at that time, in order to make it look like this was what was actually happening. So as the general election approached, the Los Angeles Times, led by editor Harry Chandler, began publishing stories claiming that Sinclair was a communist and an atheist. William Randolph Hearst's newspaper spotlighted Merriam's campaign and mocked Sinclair's. Whitaker and Baxter fed the state's papers erroneous but damaging Sinclair quotes, like the one spoken by a character in his 1911 novel, Love's Pilgrimage, on the sanctity of marriage, but attributed to Sinclair. I had such a belief. I have it no longer. Of the 700 or so newspapers in California, not one endorsed Sinclair. Merriam was advised to stay out of sight and let the negative campaigning take its toll, because of course the way he reacted to the strikes in San Francisco had been quite violent, and he wasn't very popular. So going back to the counterpunch piece, first actually, the newsreels themselves, the newsreels that they put out, the kind of most important part of this campaign, were disguised to resemble authentic newsreel footage. Mayer made sure these propaganda instruments were shown in California movie theaters, just as real newsreels were shown. The audience had no idea that they were being conned. Accordingly, they were either confused by what they saw or scared by it. One example of these fake newsreels featured herds of desperate, seedy-looking hobos emerging from the boxcars of a train. A fake journalist was there to interview them. One of the hobos explained his presence in California by proudly declaring, "Sinclair says he'll take the property of the working people and give it to us." So they were kind of creating this rift amongst people who had jobs, and of course, during the Depression era, the many, many people who were desperate for work. So now in the theaters, not everyone believed what they were seeing. As the Smithsonian Magazine article goes on to say, at least not the Sinclair reporters. Some of them booed and demanded refunds for having been subject to anti-Sinclair propaganda. Others rioted in the theaters. Greg Mitchell, the author of The Campaign of the Century, wrote that the newsreels devastated Sinclair's campaign. People were not used to them. It was the birth of the modern attack ad. People weren't used to going into a movie theater and seeing newsreels that took a real political line. They believed everything that was in them. At the end of this, Sinclair, of course, as probably you expected, lost the election. Now, we can't know for sure how much the campaign, especially the fake news aspect of the campaign, affected the result. But it seems pretty obvious that it at least had some effect, because a guy who was leading or very tight with the leader, I think he ended at 37% of the vote, and Merriman, who I mentioned was not super popular, got 47% of the vote. A lot of people were scared by the propaganda that they were seeing. So that brings us to fake news now, like fake news today, like the constant, as I think I said before, I keep overusing this word, deluge of fake news accusations and actual fake news. Now, I'd like to just mention two definitions. So I got these off Quora.com. It's a pretty good website. Like, people ask questions and then, experts give answers. I think, anyway. Misinformation is information that is false, but the reporter believes that it's true. Now, this is most of the kind of, if you want to call it that, but the misinformation we get is because, say you're watching the CBC News here in Canada. A government spokesman says that we're sure of this one thing, and then the reporter on the CBC reports it as we are sure of this thing. So, and then it turns out not to be true. So that's an example of misinformation, and it happens. I mean, especially on the internet, whether regardless of the website, but especially with smaller venues like the one that I work for. I've had to kind of learn over time to do my own fact checking, and you're going to make mistakes every once in a while. The key is to always try to recognize them and not deliberately misinform people. But like I say, I mean, every especially when you're online, it's harder, of course, with television or even YouTube. But if you are reading stuff, just check the links, because sometimes even you even have a link there and the writer just got the information wrong. It does happen. Now, much worse, and I think what was happening in the case of the gubernatorial election in 1934 in California that we were talking about, is disinformation, which is false information that the reporter knows is untrue. Now, this is the kind of news you have to be worried about, because we do see, especially with the explosion of outlets on the internet, and it's entirely a good thing, but we do see kind of people who are deliberately misinforming people about what's happening. And I see this a lot more obviously on the right than even in the mainstream media. They use a lot of dubious statistics, a lot of debunked pseudoscience. Like there's still people today, some of them even taken seriously, who actually believe there's a correlation between IQ and race, which I can tell you there is not. You can watch, I think I did an earlier video about Antifa, Richard Spencer. I called it the lie of race, but basically race is simply a social construct. So I don't think there's any need to dwell on this kind of correlation, but it has a particular political motivation. So you always have to keep your eyes open for that. I mean, the great thing about being alive now, being alive today, is that we have access to much more information, many more points of view than we ever had in history. So the onus is on you, the watcher or viewer or reader, to check the facts and think critically. I mean, it's not that difficult, I don't want to sound like I'm lecturing, but it's a Google search away to know, or at least have an idea of the truth about something. So I've gone really long today. I'd like to thank you all of you who sat through this long and watched this, and I hope you all have a really great Cinco de Mayo. Bye.